Hi guys, just a quick heads up that I'm changing up the format of the podcast for a few episodes. I've been getting so much inquiry from young adults who are deeply frustrated with a lot of aspects of wealth building in today's environment. So I have invited my good friend Ken Huang, who is a millennial, to come join me to have some candid conversation about what's happening today and really kind of share lessons and experiences that I've had along the way that I hope will be helpful to you. Please enjoy these wide-ranging and uncensored conversations. All right, so Ken, I was having this thought yesterday, which is really my inspiration for what we should talk about today, which is I was thinking, I know that I'm really careful with my money. And I know that a lot of young adults really struggle to be careful with their money. And I realize that it's not like you wake up one day and you just go, geez, I'd really love to learn how to be more mindful with my spending. Like that's really, in a nutshell, what made me go, well, if I were a young person today, and, you know, I was once a young person struggling to figure out.
Once a young person.
Yeah, like now that I'm old, but like I was once a young person who I remember, and I think I've told you this before. I remember saying to my mum, I just can't make ends meet. And she said, oh, like, wait for me. I'm going to come and sit with you and I'll work through it. And I mapped out what I was spending. And she said, I know how to fix this. And I said, what's the answer? And she said, just spend less. And I was like, frig, mum, that just doesn't help me at all. So what it made me realize is like intuitively over time, I've studied this stuff and I understand it a lot better than I used to. But I know that human nature always butts up against the practical aspects of being great with your money. So what I thought would be really great is maybe to just talk through some ideas around like what are the hacks? Because ultimately, what I think is important is how do you stop the self-sabotage? That's really the question is like people might have the right intention, but life gets in the way and, you know, you kind of bend the rules and then you spend money you weren't intending to spend or you buy something you weren't intending to buy. So how can you hack the system and come up with a way of stopping the self-sabotage? So that's what I think is going to be an interesting topic for today.
Well, let's do it because I think maybe the working title that I came up with when we were talking about this beforehand also was just that this is the 5 money hacks to build a lifetime of wealth. And we say lifetime because I think a lot of this stuff should be perennial and it should be, you know, for the rest of your life. It's not a flash in the pan. I know that's sort of a bit of an oxymoron compared to the word hack because a hack is like considered short-term as a silver bullet. But how can you actually do these things? And I think to your point, thinking about this personally, I've been my own worst enemy in a lot of ways, building wealth because of those exact things you mentioned, where I essentially don't want to do these things because the human psychology or the human mind doesn't really want to do it. So we want things easy and we want things automated. And we want things like super straightforward and we don't have to think about it. So I think we're going to go through each of these as well. So let's get started. Let's sort of set the stage for, I guess, the first one. The first one I've got here is allocate, don't budget. So do you want to sort of explain? I mean, it sounds really straightforward, but elaborate on that.
I think there's a whole psychology around budgeting, which, I mean, I could actually talk for days on this topic. I think the problem with budgeting is it's a bit like dieting. I think dieting is really hard to stick with over the long term. And I think if you want meaningful transformation physically in your body, you've actually got to do something that is sustainable. So from a money perspective, I think allocating money to specific goals is far simpler than trying to tell yourself how much you're allowed to spend on different aspects of your lifestyle. And I think what I've seen and witnessed many times, I tried this a lot when I was younger. I tried to set myself stringent budgets and they never worked. I could just never stick with it. And I ended up like feeling like I was wearing a straitjacket. Like I felt constrained. I almost felt like a budget took all the joy out of my life and took away the pleasure of buying things. And as well, like when I was on a budget, the emotion that would come up often, like not consciously, was guilt. Like I'd have this guilt around what I bought. So I think I was in my later 20s when I started becoming this, you know, getting enrolled in this idea of being an allocator. And what I love about it is if you think about allocating to kind of things that matter, you can just spend without any guilt whatsoever. So whether you want to go and spend on clothes or makeup or hair or whatever, you just do that guilt-free because you know you've taken care of business.
So I guess the psychology of it, if you were to apply the exercise or the weight loss process is this idea of having a really strict diet, and then having to stick to it very methodically. So it doesn't matter if you're hungry, it doesn't matter whatever the circumstances are, you've got this situation where you have to actually stick to it. And it's, I think, this feeling of being sort of like trapped or restricted that doesn't really bode very well for, I guess, the human psychology as well. So are you able to give like an example of how you would do this from an allocation standpoint, or maybe it's just some action steps on what can be done?
Yeah, so there's so many, I guess, frameworks and rules of thumb that are commonly published out there. There's the 50-30-20 rule. So you spend 50% of your income on your needs, 30% on your wants, and 20% on savings and investments. And then there's like a dozen other ones as well. But like what I would say to you is, if you're not sure where to start, just start with something. And essentially what it is, it's about carving up your income as it hits your bank account into these buckets. And generally I advocate separate bank accounts, different banks, different bank accounts, and, weekly allocation.
Oh, different banks as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the psychology of just not seeing accounts right next to each other means that you don't kind of, again, and I say the word hack, not in terms of a shortcut, but how do you hack the system? Like if you think of your operating system, if I have to physically go and log into a bank account that's on another app in another bank, that's just friction. So I don't do it. And what that allows to happen is that you can start to see money pile up in, let's say you're putting 20% into your savings, that can happen on autopilot. So when you can actually start to predict with a high degree of accuracy how much money you're going to save, that's like for life, that is a game changer, because then you can start to make plans around what you're going to do with that money. There's lots of other, frameworks and methodologies. There's the bucket strategy and the pay yourself first and whatever. But I guess the thing that I would say is focus on sustainability rather than extreme measures, because a little bit like dieting, you might, I've heard younger people say, well, I'm going to save 70% of what I earn and live off 30%. Inevitably, it's hard to stick with. They don't stick with it for very long, and then they throw it all in and just give up. And I say this, like, if you started as a teenager with something like this and you're setting aside the tiniest amount of money, like, it's just the habit that you want to build. There's the old ancient wisdom of if you could stick with something for 41 days, then it becomes a habit. And I don't know, how much truth there is in that. But I think the real key here around becoming an allocator is habit. Like, how do you form the habit?
There's also, the notion of like, if, you have a bad week or a few bad days where, I don't know, you spend more money than you expected or whatever that case is, right? Going back to the weight loss thing, it's kind of like, oh, you missed the gym for a couple of days, or you ate a burger, on a Thursday night, all of a sudden people just like throw in the towel and they're like, oh, it's over. Like, I've broken it. And I think the same principle applies to money, where just because you have like one bad day or one bad week where you sort of didn't manage your money very carefully doesn't mean it's game over. You just got to stay consistent over time as well. And, to your point about like different bank accounts, it was funny because, I'm on this trip and, today's my last day in Singapore. I remember like preparing for the trip, and we had this like ING debit card that we use every time we travel. It's the only time I use it. And I logged in after like 2 years, because I hadn't traveled in 2 years because of the pandemic. And we had like a few $1,000s sitting there. It was one of those things where I'm like, oh, I've got money sitting there. So I can definitely see that, because obviously if you don't see it, you don't touch it. Right. And I think going back to the psychology of it, that's actually that's a hack in my eyes, because I've experienced that myself.
I have read, I reckon, at least a dozen or more books on money management, and they've all got their own flavor of what they think works. But the thing that has worked for me is not to have savings accounts sitting alongside each other in the same bank, because the minute you do that, you can see it. It's just too tempting. It's just too tempting. So like for me personally, if I go out after having a big weekend and the money that I've allocated to my day-to-day spending is zero, I have zero shame in just going, right, oh, well, too bad. Like, I've got to take lunch from home the rest of the week. And so if you can start to think, I've got money set aside for these 2 or 3 big reasons, and I'm just not going to deviate no matter what, and, build a bit of a game around it. And that's why, like, different banks, and you must allocate weekly, because then you've just never got that long before your next little sum of money comes in. Because if you do it every month, you just die. If you burn through your day-to-day spending and you've got 25 days left till the next paycheck, it just doesn't work. So it doesn't matter how frequently you get paid, but the allocating principle is weekly.
All right, let's move on to the next one, and it's been named here as the opportunity cost in bite-sized pieces. We talk about this sort of time value of money as a concept, right? Can you explain a little bit about what time value of money is and what that entails?
Basically, and it's probably something that was born in the finance world, formulaically. But if you could get your head around this idea that there's a value of $1 today, and then there's the value of that same dollar in the future. And if you don't put that dollar to work, it will actually be worth less in the future because the cost of stuff is going to go up. So the purchasing power of that dollar is going to decrease over time. So that's one side of things. Then there's the other side of things to say, which is if you took $1 out of your pocket today and you invested it in something that grows in value, there's a cost associated with not putting that dollar into that asset. So we call that opportunity cost. And the thing to really wrap your head around, especially as a younger investor, is if you can set yourself up so there's no guilt around your spending, but what will make you hustle, what will make you kind of hungry to do something with the money that you're setting aside, the fuel to grow, if you can control assets that grow in value over time exponentially, then you can actually start to almost, and this is another, I call it a hack, but from a psychological point of view, it just makes you think twice before you spend something. The best example is there's so many different asset classes out there, but if, let's say, for example, you could put $1 into something that would earn you 7% every year, just grow in value 7% year on year, and it would compound. If you run it through the formula of what could I put that $100 in and what would it be worth, over 10 years growing at 7% compounded, your $100 more or less doubles over 10 years. That's the kind of the back of the envelope mentality that you just got to have. So let's say you've got a $100 haircut that you want to have, or a $100 bit of makeup, or you want to go and spend on $100 worth of drinks. The slight pinch that you should get every time you do that without thinking is that's costing me $200 worth of wealth in the future. I mean, if I spend that $100 now, yeah, I'll have a great time. But if I invest that $100 now, that will turn into $200 in 10 years. Obviously, you don't want to get too anal retentive about this stuff, but I always found that the way to cultivate that concept of, delayed gratification was to some degree be thinking about, if I take that dollar out of my pocket today, what's it actually going to do for my future self? And obviously, if you let that compound over a longer period of time than 10 years, and it becomes an even bigger number, it becomes thousands. And that's how there's so many graphs that describe this. But if you took $5 out of your pocket every day, I think it's something like in 50 years that would be worth nearly, $850,000 or something like that. It's just an insane number, even though people go, well, what difference does it make if I buy coffee out every day, or what difference does it make? It doesn't really make a difference. And if that's your allocated day-to-day spending and that's how you get pleasure, just go for it. I guess the point I'm making is that there's this whole concept of who cares? It doesn't make a difference. But all these small things accumulate into big things. And I guess really the purpose of me saying focus on the opportunity cost is more just to bring mindfulness to it. If you could get a little bit of a pinch of reality of what the cost is down the track, it might be an incentive to not do that.
I also see that as a bit of a counterbalance against just general society and marketing, right? Capitalism. What I mean by that is you go to McDonald's and they always ask you, do you want fries? And, you want to make it a meal out of it? Do you want to upsize? And you look at it and go, oh, it's only going to cost me an extra couple of dollars. Or, you go and get your hair done and they go, oh, you want to try this new sort of thing that we're doing? It's going to cost you only an extra $20 or whatever. So I think there's this inbuilt thing in sort of society, and particularly, when you spend your money, that it's really easy to spend because it doesn't seem like it's much more. But in actual fact, I think what you're saying here is also the idea of having a circuit breaker, having a moment where you catch yourself and going, okay, well, if I spent this $20, what am I getting? Or if I kept or hung on to this $20, what is that being contributed to as well for my future self, and what could it result in? And I think the latter is where people don't really think about that all that much, right? And I think the other point that I took away from what you just said was also this notion of obviously inflation, the dollar that you've got today is not worth the same amount in future. And that's why you always sort of hear your parents say, oh, well, we used to buy bread for this much money, or used to cost this much for, a house and things like that. But I think the overall trend over, I guess, almost the 100 years and, thousands of years of time is that generally speaking, everything gets more expensive over time as well. And so curious to know, and this is just a side note, is the idea of even just for those who are sitting on cash, you go, oh, I got some money in my bank account. I'm not putting it towards investment, but I'm also not spending it. And I'm just sitting in the bank account. I'm actually curious to know what your advice is, or if you've got a hack related to that, and how you should approach or think about that.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I think if you have a goal, let's say, for example, your goal is to save a deposit for a house, or your goal is that you need to purchase a car, or, some big ticket goal. I think that people can get too caught up in the idea of, well, it pains me to see money piling up there and I need to put it to work. And then sometimes people go out and they take unnecessary risk with their money and jeopardize the more important goal. So it's always a trade-off between getting your money to work for you versus not losing your focus on what is the real prize here, like what is the real ultimate goal here. So it doesn't always make sense to invest your money and try and get it working for you if you've got a kind of a short-term goal. Let's say, for example, you wanted to purchase a home and you're going to give yourself a window of 3 years to save a deposit for that home. There's two schools of thought. One is that you might say, well, I actually want to really learn about investing and I want to understand what my investing opportunities are. So I'm going to take a small portion of whatever I save and I'm going to play for the purpose of learning and maybe invest in something that, potentially could grow. Understanding that investing always carries some level of risk. So I'm not going to expose all of my money to it because that desire to buy my first piece of real estate is the number one priority. I think kind of understanding those trade-offs is important. Or you could say, look, I don't want to take any risk with that money. Like buying that first piece of real estate is the most important goal. But I'm just going to go over here and learn about investing so that, I'm well prepared or I'm armed for the future. Either way, you got to invest in the learning. Whether or not you use real dollars or anything significant is a separate issue. But what I would say to you is that probably if you're trying to save towards something that is going to happen within the next 12 months and maybe up to 2 to 3 years, you just don't want to necessarily mess around too much with that or take unnecessary risks. But if you then kind of go off and investigate some investment and you say, look, this is super low risk, I'm really happy to do that, then, by all means. But I think the real journey here is understanding risk in the first place, understanding investing. So I think the rule of thumb is don't risk what you need for what you don't really need. I mean, that's, So you might earn a few $100, $30,000 deposit, but do you really need, is that going to make the difference, or is the value in more the education?
I think it's quite circumstantial and obviously rooted in people's risk appetite as well, and also their personal circumstances. So I totally get your point there. But yeah, it is helpful to understand, what your own philosophy may be or your stance on this is as well, because it's not the same for everyone. And I think the thing that people get really hung up on as well is like this, for example, like these rules or these frameworks, and they stick to it very religiously without contextualizing it against their own personal situation. That's usually where they land into a lot of trouble as well. Speaking of trouble, point number 3 is this notion of wants or impulse traps, meaning, sort of buying it for the hell of it, which we see a lot of younger people do these days, versus, deep-seated desires. So do you want to just go through each one? So the impulse trap as well as the deep-seated desires, and then what are your thoughts on it?
The wording of impulse trap for me is a reference to just spontaneous spending. So there's no thought that goes into spending. You just see something and you go, oh, that looks good, I'm just going to get that. Or you hear something and you just get it. I know that a lot of people are guilty of impulse spending when it comes to late night infomercials. They do such a good job of selling you an idea for something. And I've certainly bought bloody exercise ab videos that would give me, a 6-pack in 6 weeks type thing. But I'm trying to flag here is this idea that we need to kind of bring some mindfulness to our spending in terms of distinguishing between something that is an impulse, like, oh, that looks good, I want that now, versus thinking about what a deep-seated, I actually think that would be, something I would actually want outside of this moment right now. I think it's really important to think about, how does the impulse trap come to be in the first place? And, I see it manifest in a lot of different ways. The first one is there's a lot of emotional drivers. So, and I've been guilty of this as well, where something bad happens or you feel stressed or, you feel anxious about something and you just go, screw it, I'm just going to go spend some money. I'm going to go have some retail therapy. And in fact, that's an expression that a lot of people use, retail therapy. So people spend money to elevate their mood or to de-stress. And then the other emotional driver is FOMO. And again, that's where people spend on, impulse because they don't want to miss out on a deal or a trend or a social event. And so they just buy without thinking. And then that is different to, say, for example, what I call environmental cues. And this is used by a lot of retailers. They're super smart about this. And you would see this at the supermarket, like how like Woolworths and Coles lays out their supermarkets so that you're just tempted to buy things on impulse. You know, you would have heard of Subway pumping out bread smell to try and entice people as they walk past, or kind of using techniques like urgency and scarcity to kind of say that, you know, this is a limited time offer or create a sense of urgency. So those environmental cues are kind of, a lot of people are not even aware that they're being manipulated. I think that's a really big one that leads to kind of impulse spending. And then obviously cognitive biases, which is like just the brain, people kind of manipulating the way the brain works. So like say, for example, instant gratification. You know, we are a society now where the media and the marketing is all about, you don't need to wait till tomorrow. You could have it today. And so again, they're kind of feeding us with information to make us think that waiting is just foolish. And then you've got things like sunk cost fallacy, where people get really impulsive about spending because they've already spent some, and then they think, oh, well, even if it wasn't wise, doesn't matter. Like, you know, so those sorts of things. So, and then obviously you've got social influences like peer pressure, social media. There's so many things that kind of entice us, if you like, or trick us into impulse spending. And to be honest with you, I think I'm quite a mindful spender. I would say I'm a very mindful spender. I'm very conscious of value. I'm very conscious of what I value. And I get tricked into this shit all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah,
absolutely.
You're not infallible.
No, that's right. And, you know, I mean, it's a massive minefield out there. Obviously, people are very vulnerable to this sort of stuff. And, you know, going back to my whole thing about, you know, just capitalism in general, you know, a lot of businesses, particularly the large ones, have, you know, cracked the code in terms of how they sort of get people to actually part ways with their money as well. So what are sort of what's like a framework or a set of questions that you can ask yourself to help you obviously distinguish between these impulse purchases and also these long-term desires, or these things that you should actually focus on spending your money on to build your wealth? There's
some really easy stuff out there, like give yourself 24 hours, for example, before you actually, and think about whether you really want it before you go back and buy it. But I'll give you a real life example that happens in the investing world that's kind of a bigger example. But I know that real estate agents and wealth professionals will often try and entice you into purchasing something because it's like the deal of the week, and they create scarcity and urgency around that. But if once you've been around the block a few times and you realize that that's what people are doing to you, you realize that there's a good deal every day of the week. And so I think questions to ask yourself, and just never feel pressure from other people about what you do with your money is a big one. But asking yourself the question, will this actually bring me long-term satisfaction? Or is it just a short-term buzz? Does this align with my financial goals? You know, what's driving this purchase? Is it emotion or is it logic? Is there an opportunity cost? We've already talked about that. Like, is there an opportunity cost I could consider? Will this affect my basic needs or savings? Like, that's a big one. Like, people go out and have a big Saturday night with their mates, and they forget to ask themselves the question, will I have the money to pay my rent on Monday? Have I shopped around for better alternatives? And so these are all different flavors of getting to the same point, which is, am I mindfully spending this money, or is it just, I'm just doing it, you know, on impulse, really?
Number 4, automate to accumulate. So let's discuss, what's that mean?
So a little bit like how you've just described, you've just gone into your ING account and you've just gone, holy crap, there's all this money there. Part of the reason that happened was you obviously had set up some direct transfer from your income account to that savings account, and you hadn't even noticed, or you'd forgotten about it. And, you know, lo and behold, there's all that money there. I think that there's so many pieces of software, apps, technology, and even basic internet banking that can support decisions so that you don't have to think. The housewives in decades gone by used to, run envelope systems where they'd put money into different envelopes. And that was a very painful manual system. But back in their day, if they didn't do that, they didn't eat. So there was great motivation to maintain the envelope system very vigorously. Whereas these days, a lot of people don't face that prospect of starvation, if you like. Really what they should be doing is kind of tapping into the simplest, most viable system they can to do this. And so, for example, if you get paid into bank account number one, and you can, as I said, set an automation once a week that an amount goes into an account that you have a debit card on that you can spend freely on, and another account which you set aside for, say, bills or non-discretionary, and that's it. That will prevent, I would say, 80% of the sabotage that goes on with most people around managing their money. So the whole idea of automate is kind of just figure out loosely. And, you know, I've worked with a lot of clients over the years. They see the power of this kind of system or methodology, but they agonize about like, oh, well, I need to sit down and work it all out line by line. I need to analyze my last year's worth of spending. And you, by all means, you can do that. But I would actually say a back of the envelope type calculation is also good enough to get people started. It's not rocket science. And the whole idea is you could refine it. You know, if you're in and out of work or if your money goes up and down, you can adjust, but just set up the basic system. I would say even if you're only saving the tiniest amount of money, it's the psychology of the habit that you're really trying to cultivate.
And let's talk about the last one, emotional intelligence, right? Which is, you're calling it hidden financial asset. What do you mean by that?
Look, I think the more you know yourself, the easier life is, frankly. I mean, on all levels. But when we're talking about money, if you know that certain things, actually hate this word, but trigger you, certain people, certain influences kind of make you spend money in a way that maybe you don't like, or make you use your resources in a way that you don't like, you just want to be aware of that. So the best example I could give you of this is we accumulate friends when we're at school because you're just in the same environment, and friends can have all sorts of habits that help and hinder. And what happens often is you can catch up with friends later in life and realize that there's huge misalignment of values, like what matters to you versus what matters to them. And so in my life, I knew that there were people that I knew in my 20s who just couldn't spend money fast enough. Their thrill was like just going to the latest concerts, the latest restaurants. And I enjoyed that, but never felt like it was my highest value. And I was just kind of tailing along, if you like. And so I think this concept of financial empathy is really about recognizing that part of your journey is going, well, what matters to me? Do those things actually matter to me, or are they somebody else's values? So I'm saying emotional intelligence, if you can invest a little bit of energy into that, not in a woo-woo way, but in a really pragmatic way. And it's asking yourself the questions of what matters. Because I see people kind of go on a journey when it comes to money where they think that having more money is going to solve their problems. And it does make life easier up to a point. And there's so many studies on this as well, where they show like happiness with money goes up to a certain point and then it tails off or flattens off. And so I think if you can kind of recognize that, whether you're, you know, where you want to be or not, then the real journey is actually understanding like what is it that influences your financial decisions, because it will actually remove friction and make your speed and journey on wealth building so much faster.
Yeah, I can probably speak to that on a personal level as well, because just coming out of high school and then going to uni, you know, I stayed in an apartment, you know, 2-bedroom apartment, 4 boys, and, you know, spent a lot of Friday and Saturday nights just pissing our money away with, you know, drinks and dinner and, you know, just hanging out with friends. And, you know, it's like that sort of classic adage of like you're the average of the 5 people around you. I think that's very much true in money as well. And I could have been so much further along now that I look at it in hindsight, and just, you know, sort of being around a different circle of people who have different priorities and really want to do something with their money as well, it gave me a lot of clarity to understand. I'm like, oh, wow, holy shit. Like during that time, you know, all that money that was probably spent there. And I don't even like drinking. Like, I don't even like alcohol. It was like, you know, spending money that honestly just didn't actually add any value to my life. And and going back to, you know, one of the key points where you were talking about the opportunity cost, it's like that got me thinking about potentially where the money could have gone towards as well. Now, that's not to say that, you know, there was great memories made and a lot of enjoyment, socializing, and a lot of friendships and bonds being made. But I think at least on a wealth level, there would have been more pragmatic ways to do that without spending, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on a weekend on this as well. So I think it's more about that self-awareness, but also I think if we're talking about all of the hacks that you're talking about in general, just to round this out, you're essentially creating environments for yourself that enable you to manage your money very responsibly without it being feeling very constrictive or letting you sort of like as humans just sort of get in our own way. And I think we talk about our good friend Mike in Study, and he talks about, creating enabling environments for you to be able to consistently learn. I think it's the same thing here in money management, which is that, yes, in theory, this is the right thing to do, just like eating well and exercising daily is the right thing to do. If you don't create the right circumstances, environment for you to do that, and it's going to be really hard to follow, and you end up falling off the bandwagon as well. So that's all I've got to say. Have you got anything else that you wanted to sort of share as a way to wrap up?
Yeah, so I would actually say it's environments, but more importantly, it's like cultivating micro habits, because like money, micro habits will compound. And for me, my truth absolutely is that micro habits will make you a multimillionaire. There's a fantastic quote by a guy called Will Rogers, and he basically says that the quickest way to double your money is to fold it in half and put it back in your pocket. And, it's a bit tongue in cheek, but the essence of that is if you can learn to be really mindful and create these habits that just kind of stop you from self-sabotage, no question, you will be a multimillionaire.
Great way to round it out. Thank you, Selena.
Awesome. Thanks, Cam.
Excellent.